So as I kick off, I thought I would do something different for this presentation, something that I have never done before. I've done many presentations, like many lectures, but I decided that why not? This is an AI conference. Why not go ahead and generate all my slides with generative AI, which is what I did. So what I did to generate these slides is I wrote out my talk, which I normally don't do, but I wrote it out as a script. Then I loaded that into ChatGPT, GPT-4. Then I said, take my speech, segment my speech into multiple slides. My talk is about 40 minutes, so pace me against 40 minutes. I gave it my reading speed. I then went through, it created slides for me. Then I said, okay, name those slides. It did those. Then I said, okay, fantastic. For every one of those slides, create bullet points that create the central theme of those slides. It made the bullet points for me. I then said, for every single slide, I think it's every slide, most slides, give me a prompt that I can give back to you to generate an image for that slide. It wrote a prompt for me. I took that prompt, I pasted it back into DALL-E. Didn't want to bother with Midjourney for this one. So loaded it in there, and that's the image I used. In general, most of the slides you'll see is going to be exactly what the generative LLM or image generator put there. If it did something absolutely crazy, I didn't take that version. I reprompted. So this is a good example probably of generative AI with human editorial layered on top. I did name the talk. All right, so AI is inevitable. I think I wrote that line. I don't think LLM wrote that line. That would be scary if the AI wrote that line. But I wrote that line, so let's qualify that out. I only realized that just now. I should probably adjust how I tell this story. But I think that AI is just inevitable at this point, right? I think everyone here probably feels that way. It's being used, it's being adopted at a tremendous rate. I'm not going to go into the exponential adoption of AI, but I, as a computer scientist in my career, I came into healthcare only maybe in 2018, but I've been through a lot of transformations, right? I was here for Web 1. I was bringing online the internet. I had a career in building out mobile technologies and operating systems. I worked on the Android team. I sold that a startup to Google. But AI feels different, right? Because AI is so quickly being adopted. It already was in a lot of different places, even before the last maybe 18 months when it really accelerated into all of our minds. And it just has the opportunity to change the way we do everything because it's a technology which definitionally is very close to the way human beings think. So I think, and I would call out to everyone, that this is the theme of how I would like to think about aging. I would like to live in a world where age is just a number. That's it. You've all heard the phrasing, right? Like, oh, age is just a number. But when people say age is just a number, we say it facetiously, right? Because we all know that age is actually not just a number. There is clearly degradation that comes with aging. Everyone knows that. And so, I mean, part of the sort of joke is that, well, age isn't just a number, but we all want to pretend that it is. And how long can we live that way such that we feel young? And when I think of the phrase health span instead of lifespan, let's think of it in that context of making age just a number. And what I mean by that is, what is old age? But if you want to flip it around, it's actually helpful to say, what is not being old? What does being young mean? And I think that people associate these things with physical capability, energy levels, maybe mental acuity. There's a certain thing that we associate with being young, and there are things that we associate with being old. And I think that the key thing about healthcare and applying it towards aging is to blur the distinction between those things and to make it so that there isn't this distinction between being old and young, but more of a continuum on which we are all sitting somewhere on the line. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. I'll also talk about the fact that I actually think this is already true. We just don't necessarily feel that it's true. And that's another part of framing the problem. Another thing that I want to really point out here is AI is not just how do we engage with something through a language model. It is not just simply how do we look at large amounts of data sets. AI enables us to accelerate technology innovations in lots of different areas and glue it together with AI, right? Because we're very good as a species at creating technological innovations, immensely good. This is a very different kind of technology because it lets us do the human part faster, right? Because whenever you have a phone, you bring a mobile phone, and everyone was getting iPhones in like 2007, we're rolling out 3G, then 4G, now 5G networks. There's always a human at the center of that. There's always a reason, and that reason is something that touches a human being, right? Like you build technology because at some point it's going to touch a human being. And with AI, we now suddenly have the ability to sort of have this other dimension to how we innovate. We have the ability to say, well, what happens if the customer of this technology that I'm using isn't a human at all? The human is now moving several levels of indirection away. Of course, there will probably almost always be a human eventually, but it lets us add 1, 2, 3, many, many levels of indirection because you can add a human-like substrate to this all and say, well, this technology is actually going to be glued by AI, and maybe the output of that is going to be glued together by AI, maybe the output of that is glued together by AI, and all of that can happen at the speed of silicon, and then that ends up creating an output that hopefully then benefits a human being at the end. And that's one of the reasons why I think AI feels so different in terms of technology. A bit about me. I have a varied background. I like to be in a lot of different places at once. I am the CEO of Clover Health. As I said just now, we are a Medicare Advantage company, which means we are a health insurer. We look after the Medicare population exclusively. That would be the 65 plus, the disabled, or those with ESRD or ALS. And I am also a computer scientist. My background is almost entirely in computer science. Before coming into healthcare, I actually worked on mobile operating systems. I am a systems engineer in terms of background. I had a startup which I sold to Google, which was entirely about building a custom version of Android. So normally very, very deep in the code. At Google, I was focused on the Android side of things, as well as in being in cloud and working on machine learning within the cloud environment. And so I have a background in ML and AI as well. And I came into healthcare, into Clover in 2018, with a focus on how do we take all of these technologies and bring them to the betterment of hopefully many, many people, everyone in healthcare. And one of the key insights that I think had me make my move in a particular way, and I think this is relevant to the conversation today, and the conversation that many of you actually have come up to me in the last day or two to talk to me about, is that healthcare is also a very different place to apply technology. Sorry, I should stay back on the previous slide for a second. It's a different place to apply technology. Why is healthcare different? And the reason why I would say it is that, first of all, healthcare is a very weird industry. Healthcare, as has been mentioned a couple times by a few speakers here over the last couple days, healthcare is I wouldn't say a broken system, though its outputs are broken, but it's a weirdly designed system, right? Firstly, it's a tripartite system. And I say this all the time, and it's something I think is core and not talked about enough. We don't have a bipartite system, but almost all of our thinking about industries are bipartite. There's a consumer and there's a seller, right? Like that's how we think about it. There's a reason why I work at something called a payer. That's because in healthcare, we have separated the payment from the providing side, the clinicians normally, and the consumer, the patients, are actually in three different areas, not in two different areas. And that creates a set of dynamics and a set of interplay between those areas that is very unusual and counterintuitive. So that's one thing about healthcare. And I will touch on the healthcare industry. I'll talk about application in a second, but if you want to ask me questions about how healthcare works, I'm happy to take those at the end. The other dimension about healthcare that's different, and I think this is relevant to many of the people here, is when you're coming out of research, when you're coming out of academic settings, it's known that it's difficult to bring and do translational research and translate your findings into the commercial world. That's known. That happens in a lot of different places. I would put forward to all of you, it is particularly difficult in healthcare. So if you're saying, well, this just doesn't make sense, it's so hard, it's so weird, you're not alone. That's not just you. It is the buying environment. The environment of healthcare itself makes it incredibly difficult to translate technologies and new innovations into, even when they're not bleeding edge, like AI. Even basic things coming into healthcare are very challenging. And I'll talk more about how I think we crack that problem. Let me shift to something personal for a second, because I would like to talk a little bit about my situation, about why I'm so passionate about this topic. So there's something called Marfan syndrome. Clinicians, the doctors in the room, you may have learned about this in med school. I have Marfan syndrome. It's a congenital condition. It's genetic, and it basically affects your connective tissues. As I was laughing at just now, it said that there are some people who can't use fingerprint readers. I find it very difficult to use fingerprint readers because my fingers bend. And so when I try and put my fingers on the fingerprint readers, my fingers bend around the fingerprint reader. And so even though my fingerprints are there, the scanner just literally can't find the fingers because my fingers will bend around the fingerprint reader. The main thing Marfan syndrome is known for, though, is not the fingers, though that is how you often find someone and diagnose them. It's the fact that you have a aorta that is flexible. You often get an aneurysm. If you get an aneurysm in your aorta, you often get a dissection. That means it tears. And if it tears, it's obviously really, really bad. And maybe you die right away. Maybe you make it to the emergency room and you have emergency surgery. The reason why I bring this up is a major theme, and it's been a theme that permeates, and many of you are working on things like this, is I want to say how important, incredibly important, early detection is of conditions, of diseases, and how that can be applied right now to help people right now. And if we use AI to accelerate early diagnosis, we can be helping people almost right away in real-world clinical settings, because it is so frequent that people are just not being diagnosed for the conditions, and for conditions for which there is clear management. So the example I would give, and I'm sorry, but this is slightly morbid, but the diagnosis condition for Marfan is effectively someone has to die in order for you to be diagnosed. And let me tell you what that means. Maybe not die, but have a very traumatic event. You have a very traumatic event. You have a dissection. You go to the hospital. Maybe hopefully you get diagnosed. Hopefully they fix you. In my case, I've been very well managed since birth, and that's because my father had a dissection. And so when my father had a dissection, I was put on medication, and when I was put on medication, I've been well managed my whole life. I might be lucky. I may never dissect. I may never need to have the surgery because I take a pill, a generic. That pill costs $10 a month, right? And that could potentially avert a hundreds of $1,000 surgery and a lot of trauma for me. So the distinction here is Marfan syndrome, easily something where early detection helps a lot, easily something where there are clear physiological signals, right? Where it is just being missed all the time, right? I was sitting at dinner the other day, but I look at people all the time, and I just look at their fingers from across the room, and I say, well, what do their fingers look like? Do they have Marfanoid features? Like, is that something I can do? And yes, I can do that. I can have conversations with people. But what if you could just scan all the pictures that anyone produces? And who has the time to do that? AI has the time to do that, right? There's no way I can do that. There's no way, even if everyone in this room to do it, we all put in like some time, there's no way we can do that. Google can do that. Facebook can do that, right? You don't need some expensive test or whatever. You can be like, that's a Marfanoid characteristic. So I want to think about this, and I'm deliberately picking words that might be a little bit unusual, but I want us all to think about them. Early detection as a thing that's functionally equivalent to cure, right? Because to me, if I don't have to have the surgery, and yes, I have the fingers, but I don't have to have the surgery. If I don't have to have the surgery, my chronic condition, because it'll never go away because it's genetic, is as good as cure to me. I don't need someone to take away the bendiness. I'm okay with it. I find it kind of amusing, right? There's some other areas which are a little annoying, but I don't mind those either. It's really the aortic situation that I want managed. And if I take that pill, or if we find a pill which really, really manages it perfectly, and not just beta blockers, I would say good enough. Early detection effectively has given me something which I would consider a cure. I know definitionally cures mean you got rid of it, but that's not what I'm going for. What I'm going for to the patient, it is functionally equivalent to cure. And I would say for many chronic conditions, this is actually the case. If you catch it early enough, that with existing therapeutics, we don't even need new therapeutics. I would love them, but we don't even need new therapeutics. If we catch them early enough and get them on those existing therapeutics, you can give an outcome that is functionally equivalent to cure because you can keep them so well managed. Putting aside the issues we talked about earlier, where compliance to medications, et cetera, et cetera. So for chronic disease, obviously not trauma, you can't really early detect trauma, but for chronic disease, early detection is functionally equivalent to cure, I would assert. And I would also assert that AI can comb through vast amounts of data where we can't do everything yet, but we can do vastly more than we're doing today in terms of finding and identifying knowable early signs of those chronic conditions. So I will put that forward with you. So then my next part of my logical chain is aging is a chronic condition. I would say, so I said that I think that if you catch it early enough, if you identify a chronic condition early enough, you can manage it with existing therapeutics. I would say aging, we should think of it as a congenital chronic condition. It is a chronic condition that you were born with. Every single one of us in this room was not born with Marfan. I don't know if anyone else has it. I was, so maybe that is at least one. But every person in this room was born with a genetic condition called aging. Maybe it's a syndrome. Maybe it has a variety of outcomes here. But as you look at it, I think more and more as we look at all the data, as we look at how AI can analyze the data, this is the way I would look at it, because when we say age is just a number, I just don't think that we should say, well, that's an old age thing, or that's a young age, or that's a young thing. Frailty is, you can have frailty due to the nature of aging. You could have frailty because you have Marfan. I'm not old. I can be frail, right? Just because I haven't lived in a large number of years doesn't mean that I'm automatically strong. There's many people who are like that. There are many people who are weaker than I am, right? We're all on different timelines. We're all on different personal journeys. So we need to split apart the experience of the patient, the clinical experience, the psychological experience, and put it on a different set of scales, put it on a different set of axes, and not just look at it as aging, right? That number, which is the number of years you've lived, just becomes another input into the model that predicts what might happen to you next. And if we can do that, and then we can look at all other conditions as sort of branching off this aging sort of master condition, we can say, well, we can make predictions. We can say for this kind of person, this is likely to happen at this age. For this other person, this is likely to happen at another age. And that's just a very challenging thing to do if you do it at a population health level. It's hard to do even at a cohort level. It's possible, I think, to do at a personalized level, but it's so hard, right, traditionally to have done that. But with all the data that we're gathering, with where we can go with AI, I think this is where we eventually head, where, once again, the number of years you live is just an input and not even the major input, right? It's the dominant input right now when we think of the diseases of aging. I don't think it should be. I don't think it has to be. So we talk about this at Clover all the time. Remember, we're a Medicare company. We're a Medicare company that is run by a computer scientist, and we have a very clinical, technological, data, and AI-oriented view towards what we do. And I'll tell you exactly what we do in a second. But I talk about this all the time, which is the greatest hits of aging, right? These are the major disease groups: congestive heart failure, COPD, diabetes, CKD, dementia, right? Things that we're all thinking about over here. And these greatest hits of aging, it's very clear that there's disease groups that cause most of the suffering, disease, degradation, as well as what consumes a lot of the mind share of the clinicians who look after our population. And when we look at those particular diseases, the vast majority of those can actually be caught earlier than we're catching them today, right? When I say catch, I mean identify. Identify them earlier by clinician. Identify them more with primary care, because too many of these conditions right now, you have to go to a specialist for confirmation. We want to identify with primary care, and we want to start treatment earlier. And I'll show you some data in a second where we're seeing that when primary care physicians identify and start treatment earlier, you see very impressive effects on the overall health of a given patient. So for these particular disease groups, it's an incredible focus of mine to I point my AI, my ML image engineers on how do we use our data to make these predictions earlier, put them in the hands of PCPs earlier, and have them respond to them, and then confirm and manage these conditions. I would say that one of these conditions is slightly more challenging than the others, and that is dementia, that is Alzheimer's, right? Like would fall into that particular category. I think we will get into the same place. There's a lot of work, obviously, that everyone is putting into here, more and more research. The reason why that particular condition is different than the others is because it is currently less actionable. I don't think it's forever less actionable. I think we'll figure it out. But what we need in all of these cases is early identification, and we need a management methodology that gives you that functionally equivalent to cure kind of effect. And we don't have that right now on the Alzheimer's side. Happy to answer more questions on that, but that's why that's less of an immediate focus, because until the life sciences side catches up a little bit, it's harder to work on that one. The other conditions, there's huge amount of patient value to be delivered just by helping doctors sift through all the data and diagnose earlier. So this is a chart I sometimes show. This is how I think many patients think disease progresses. They're like, you know, yesterday I've been living my life, I've been eating whatever I want, I didn't have diabetes, then I went to the doctor and he did a blood test and suddenly I have diabetes. Now I have diabetes. Yesterday I wasn't a diabetic, today I'm a diabetic. I'm hearing a lot of it's true, so I'm like, it's kind of like that, right? And so the psychological is that you're like, I don't have it, I got a diagnosis, I have it, I'm a diabetic now. Like it's an identity that suddenly is thrust upon you. We know that that's not how it works, right? People act like this is how it works. It's clearly not how it works. It should look a little bit more like this, which is there is a ramp up where diabetes is starting to take hold. There's degradation, right? Like the A1C is starting to get out of control. And that ramps up to the diagnosis moment, the moment where the doctor and the patient suddenly realize that there's diabetes that needs to be managed. It's not like, boom, diabetes. That's not how it works. So there's this ramp-up moment. And so I would say, okay, most people would say, all right, yeah, I know that's kind of how it works. You could argue that people are, willfully blind to this, or you could argue that people just don't think about their health all the time. And I think it's a combination of all of these things that cause this to actually happen. But all of this, I think, is going to arc towards where the opportunity sits for these kinds of things. I would argue that with AI, we will eventually decide that the curve looks like this, as opposed to this, right? The reason this starts so late is because that's when it starts to enter our perception, or that's when we, whether we believe it or not, think it's reasonable that a doctor would even start looking at these things. We're still looking at the data, we're still thinking of the data with the concept of a human being and how much time they have. And that's a little exercise that I would ask everyone to put through your own little mental view, is when you think of any AI problem, how much is your own bias as a human being being constrained to that's not possible because deep down you don't think someone has time to do it, not because you think it's actually hard or you think it's impossible. What AI suddenly gives us is the ability to say we are freed and unshackled from that no human has time to do that aspect. That is fundamentally what AI gives us. And so what we suddenly say is, what if you had 50,000 doctors with nothing better to do than to look at your own personal medical record and read every word of it? I bet you they might find some things or have some views, probably 50,000 of them. So as you look at that, I would assert that we will live in this particular world, right? Where with AI, we are able to use the data we already have. Many of you are working on increasing the amount of data we have, but with the data we already have, we will be able to look further ahead or back in time, depending where you start. We will be able to manage conditions earlier and with those existing therapeutics, and then deliver that functional cure that I'm hoping for. So actually, let me make one more point on this slide. I think that it's important, and this is something which is so fantastic about the fact that this is a symposium on aging. I said just now, forward or back in time, depending on how you decide to look at it. I don't think those are equivalent in terms of how what you end up solving for. There are people who actually already are looking at the far left side of this, right? When you're looking at embryonic genetics or something like that, you're like, well, let me try and predict with this kind of level of genetics. Let me join that together with data sets. What's going to happen to this child? What's going to happen to this embryo even, right? Like infertility, it's in pediatrics, all those kinds of things. And I think, in the, if you think about 23andMe and stuff, and quantified self people, they're really starting on the left-hand side. And they're trying to say like, well, how do I take the data from those people who are already old in their mind? And how do I fit that to me, right? How do I fit that back to me and make some predictions or some opinions and figure out what I can do? And that's nothing wrong with that. And I think these are a particular set of solutions to these problems. But we all here, including myself, actually start on the other side, right? We look at folks who are older, who have higher disease burdens. And when we look at that, the key thing is when you are looking at the young folks, it's automatic in your mind to say, how do we roll this forward? It's very natural as human beings to look at a child. How do I look forward into their future? It's less natural, but equally productive to look at someone who is older and say, how do I roll this backwards? Because if I can roll this backwards, I can look at people who are in the cohort right before the person I'm looking at, and I can intervene. Then I can look at the cohort right before that, and I can intervene. We don't have to roll it back all the way to childhood. I think eventually we will. But since we're all working on folks who are older, I think we can start at the end and say every single innovation we develop in that area can be applied to those particular cohorts. That's what we're doing at Clover. Every time we discover something, figure something out, we can find people in our cohorts who we can immediately help. Because we're like, you look like that. Okay, we've looked a little bit more into your future and we can try and intervene. Right? And we can look like, okay, let's roll it a little bit further back. Let's roll it a little bit further back. So that's why many of you who have talked to me over the last day or so, I have been encouraging to say, well, why don't we go out and start helping people? Let's figure this out right away because there are people we can help right now. And let's do that. That feels good. That's on mission. And also gives validation to technologies. It validates our theories. Not everything will work out, but many of the things will. And we can deploy in there and start rolling back that clock and pulling down toward that light blue line towards the left-hand side. And so what we can say is, well, we're able to anticipate this disease 6 months earlier, 12 months earlier, 18 months earlier, 24 months earlier, right? And I'll show you some data that we have about where we're doing exactly that, and we just progress from there. And so this is what I mean by we can start developing now. You all know this. You are all working on it. But I do want to emphasize a couple of different things. I get asked often, well, Andrew, why don't you work on commercial insurance? Why don't you work on the individual exchanges? Why are you focused on Medicare? And I say, well, first of all, I like helping people who are older. I like that, sort of ingrained in me. But also, I want to help with chronic disease. Remember, if we go back to the start of the talk, I am focused on making aging into a chronic condition, and then I'm focused on curing chronic conditions with earlier identification and detection and management. That's my thing. Well, we want to go to the place that has a lot of chronic conditions. You don't want to go to the young population. The young population, the entire game is just to deal with the people reactively who get sick, and then just hope the majority of people don't really get sick. That's kind of like the earlier game, certainly in insurance. When you look at the older population, you don't have that available to you anymore. What you have is a population that is going to get sick and maybe already be sick and is going to get sicker no matter what you do. And your goal is to slow that as much as possible. So that not only gives you a very rich environment to have impact on the right-hand side, you can feel good, you're helping people. It also gives you a lot of data as you're having that impact on how you actually been helping those people, and you can keep feeding that into the middle point, a quick feedback cycle. The faster we accelerate this, which once again, this is where AI comes in. The data is there. I'll talk about it in a second. The impact is there because we're human beings and we have plenty of seniors. The middle one is where AI comes in. We start that loop faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And what that means is the loop between impact and data gets faster, because every time you have impact, you are actually having data generation, right? Every time something works, that is a new piece of data that you have. And you can feed that into your models, loop it back around, and say, okay, now what do I do next? And that lets you also take a far more incremental view towards model generation, a far more incremental view towards trying to help people, and get going immediately. So once again, that's why I've been talking so much about loving the projects that have been worked on by all of you, and saying, how do we get that into a real world scenario? A, because I like helping people, right-hand side, and B, getting it into a real world scenario will accelerate the development of these particular therapeutics and or detection models and or whatever else people are working on. So let's talk about data for a second. This is actually my core background. I'm gonna get an alert here. This is the slide that generative AI made when I said to give it a prompt. I am not standing behind any of these numbers, but it looked about right. So I was like, yeah, fine, you can do that, right? But it was like, yeah, that's a number of devices in the world. I was like, sure, seems good. But it's directionally correct. So we've instrumented the world, right? I was a mobile person, mobile devices person, IoT person, network person, whatever you want to call about it. Like I like mobile operating systems. But we definitely have many, many, many more devices, and we definitely have much better wireless networks than we ever have had, right? And that's only in the last 50 years or so, right? 2007 iPhone came out. And that really accelerated everything. Remember, first iPhone, not even on 3G, was on Edge, I think, right? Like 2.5G. So we have many, many, many devices. They're all out there. I did particularly like a lot of the themes that we're in today, because there's something I've always been saying is we've instrumented the world. I think we've just been successful in instrumenting the world. Like so many devices are now connected to Wi-Fi. My coffee maker is connected to Wi-Fi. I don't know why it needs a Wi-Fi connection, but it wants one. And so like plenty of stuff is like stuck on our Wi-Fi networks, but we keep on just rolling out more of these devices because I don't think we're actually measuring anything, right? I have a coffee maker, it's connected to the internet. What is it measuring? What is it doing with that connection? I don't know, but it does know how much coffee I drink, or certainly my household drinks. Is anyone using that data? No. Is it? Yes. Structured or unstructured, it's sitting somewhere. So I want to point people towards how do we get more usage out of the devices we already have? And I think there was actually a couple folks who are working on exactly this form of the problem, because I don't think that we actually have to spend that much more effort on instrumenting the world. Now, don't get me wrong. Is there more potential in instrumentation? There's enormous potential in instrumentation. The only difference is what I'm saying is we haven't even eaten what's on our plate already. We have plenty to use there. And especially, once again, in a world of AI, which is able to process and consume and make conclusions on data, you don't want your bottleneck to be further rollout of devices. That's slow. AI doesn't necessarily help with that. It's much better to push our models to do more conclusions on the data we already have than it is to wait for more data to come in. So that's why I said, start with the data, follow with AI. And these are just some examples of things that we're that we're doing, and the folks that are working on over here. I didn't at the time really know what was going to be presented at the poster session, so I just took a guess as to what I might see when I came here, and this was kind of my guess. But these are the problems we're trying to solve. But what I would once again say is, we don't need to necessarily say, okay, well, this is the problem. How do we get the data we need to solve this problem? I think that is the wrong way to look at the problem. What we should do is say, this is the data I have. How do I somehow use the data I have to solve the problem, and try and use AI as an accelerant to solve that? Because when we do that, once again, the bottleneck becomes the computational power, the bottleneck becomes how smart the AI is, and that will accelerate very, very quickly. Waiting for more data, sitting and saying, well, if only I could get that data from that particular health system, from that hospital, it's just going to take forever. That will take forever, right? We need to start with the data that we already have. I'm not saying all of you have enough data. I have a lot of data because I'm a health plan. But once we get access to that data, all I'm saying is we can then say, how do we use this data to solve problems? Most people in industry, definitely people in healthcare, are saying, here's a problem. How do I solve it with AI? Instead, what we should be saying is, here's the data we have. What problems can I solve? with using AI on this data set. So I just want to put this through. This is a rough model I have. I don't think it's not a clinical model. It's not for medical score and things. The way I think of it almost as a health insurer. There's a few phases in here. Looking for problems, monitoring. You don't have a problem yet, but looking for problems. Identification. You have this particular condition. You have this particular problem. Then we treat, and then hopefully we cure. We may not always cure, but hopefully we cure. That's kind of like how I think about it, right? Maybe it's a very engineering way to think about healthcare, but that's kind of the life cycle of a healthcare problem in my mind. What tends to happen? There's not really any monitoring. Everyone's sort of just sitting around waiting for something to happen. Not waiting for something to happen, but when there's nothing happening to you, you're not really monitoring for something to happen to you. Just you're like, oh, I feel good. I'm healthy, right? You don't know that you're healthy. There is no immediate issue that needs solving or that needs identification. So what actually tends to happen is something has to present as a problem before we even try to identify it. Not a lot of people are spending time looking for things that are wrong with them that have not yet presented as a problem. Yeah, you can have hypochondriacs and things, but what I'm talking about is like looking for like in a structured way. I want to bring it back to another theme. This is something that's very intuitive to me, but I think that is very related to my personal experience because I have Marfan syndrome. Is that I'm very in tune with lots of things might go wrong with me and no one really knows because no one understands. It's a rare condition. People don't really fully understand it. So I'm more like, okay, well, is this related? Is this related? What else is this? And connective tissue goes through your whole body, so anything can go kind of weird at any given time. So I think I intuitively say always be looking at your body, feeling, looking around, seeing whether or not there might be something wrong. But most people aren't doing that. But in the case of Marfan syndrome, I was saying, a lot of monitoring, lots of identification of problems, treatment, no real cure. And I said that earlier, right? I said I go for functional equivalent of cure. There is no actual cure for Marfan. But so my view is we want to bring these two worlds together. What we want to do is monitor everything all the time and move a lot of the effort of healthcare into that monitoring phase, that very first phase. Because what did I say earlier? What did I call these particular conditions? I called them the greatest hits of aging, and there's a reason for that. The reason is because almost certainly, if you live long enough, you will develop at least one of these conditions, right? So you know it will happen. It is borderline inevitable that it will happen. Yet even when that happens, there is not enough monitoring, and we are not looking out for it. And there's only so much doctors and clinicians can do because we can't put everything on doctors and clinicians to solve these problems. So with AI, we can use the large data sets we have. We can point them towards this particular problem. We can say, how do we look for the emergence of these problems in the population? How do we do it at a personalized level? Because we know for any given person that as they get older, they are almost certainly likely to develop one of these, sometimes at 75, sometimes at 55. Remember what I said, age is just a number, right? But we know it will probably happen. So that's what we're focused on. But what I'm focused on is for these major areas, how do we find those as early as possible? I put this in because I found it fun. I said in the prompt for this, the slide is called Clinicians Can Use AI to Help Them Right Now. Give me an image of a clinician using AI to help them make diagnoses. Make sure you make it as practical, down to earth, and reasonable as possible. And this is what it made. And I said, all right, we'll put that in. Like that, that's fine. But I went to pains in my prompting, I assure you, to try and not have that. But that's what AI thinks a clinician using AI is from a very reasonable, grounded perspective. Early identification and management of CKD. So this is a case study that we use a lot. We publish these what I call mini white papers. They're not full. They have scientific review, but they're not scientific papers. This is what we found in our experience when we put an AI model that gives useful tips. And by that, I'm not insisting to a clinician that they look at them, but we're trying to be as helpful as possible. But what we see is when armed with data and insights, and then armed with an AI model helping them, the same doctor, before and after being given the tool, and this is a CKD, a chronic kidney disease based model, is actually identifying CKD stage 3. We use stage 3 because that's what will normally be identified without AI, because it starts to become problematic and symptomatic at that stage. It's hard to do 1 and 2 with that. So with the control, you're able to say stage 3, they'll eventually find it. But with AI assistance, they will identify it about a year earlier, and with significantly higher GFR. So we're having better kidney function, and we're having it earlier. Now, I want to note one thing. Many people think AI is like, and I get asked this all the time, and then do you give them tips and next steps and change the treatment protocol? We don't do any of that. But first of all, physicians don't necessarily want it or need it. We could eventually. But in this case, notice the gradient of the decline is approximately the same. That's because largely the exact same treatment is being used. It's just being initiated earlier, right? But if it's initiated earlier, it just stays higher for much longer, right? And we're slowing the progression to stage 4, hopefully not stage 5 in ESRD, but maybe, right? So this is a slide I'd like to show for the effect of how with the right clinician favorable interface and AI models, you can actually have an enormous impact right now. This is actual data. This is based on actual data right now, arming PCPs to diagnose a relatively complicated disease. So just to sum up, turning age is just a number. Number 1, aging is a chronic condition. We all have it. There's no form of us that we're all aging. It's just the way time works. Except that there's no age at which we turn old. Hopefully intuitive, but it's not the way we solve problems. But there's no age at which we turn old. Focus on augmenting our garnishing and getting access to existing data and saying existing data is good enough. Existing therapeutics are good enough. How do we get massive impact just with AI? That's not normally how people are thinking about it. Most of the time, people are like, if only I could get, we had more data, we had more instrumentation, if only we had new therapeutics. No, for a lot of places, we have enough data. You just got to believe it. We have enough, the right therapeutics. You just got to believe it. How do you use AI now to close that gap? And it's surprising how you will actually find ways to do that if you start with that as your problem thesis. And then how do we deliver it into the hands of real-world clinicians? At Clover, we specialize at this. That is why I am a computer scientist who runs an insurance company, is so that I can do that last one extremely quickly. One of the offers we've made here is that we will help do that for any number of you. Is if you're able to solve the rest of these parts of it, we'll help you. I will help you get it into the hands of real-world human clinicians to deliver that impact. All right. With that, I would love to take some questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for a thoughtful and very engaging presentation. I hesitate at the word age is a chronic condition, but I'll ask you, and I don't know if this is a fair question, for a health insurance representative.
Go for it.
Is it how can you prevent other companies than Clover Health companies to capitalize on this early detection of disease and discriminate against older adults with this worse age as a chronic condition, worse chronic condition?
So how do we actually go about and say when things are identified earlier, how do we make sure that there's no discrimination or unexpected effects that sort of like come and flow from that? I think there's a couple of different dimensions. One, if you give a very health insurance question, once you reach a Medicare age, and that's the age we're working on right now, it's a great question. It's not necessarily a problem because in Medicare, we are forbidden from underwriting. And what that means is no matter what your health condition is, we still must accept you into Medicare. And that's just written in the rules, and that's just how it works. So it's actually not possible to have that particular form of discrimination. The ACA, which is also known as Obamacare, fixed that problem within the individual changes. We got rid of pre-existing conditions and things like that, so that can now be eliminated. You cannot be underwritten against that. There are two places you can be underwritten against it. One is life insurance, right? But normally the older population is not buying life insurance, but at a younger age, it can be the case. And the second place is if you buy something called Medigap. If you want to know about Medigap, I'll leave that for now. It's more complicated, but that's the other place you could possibly be discriminated against. My view on that is that the way we would go as a society is that we're already removing this concept of risk-based underwriting from health in a couple of different places. Like I said, Medicare and the individual exchanges. At commercial, always you were prevented from doing it. So in most of healthcare, for health insurance, we actually no longer can charge different rates. We can't do all those things for people who are sick. It's just those two remaining places. And I think that it should be eliminated from there as well.
Totally agree. Dr. Fan.
Just a quick empirical question. So the CKD study that you did, how big was the training data set for you to end up with that nice outcome?
So the question, so that people outside can hear it, is that how big was the population studied in that CKD study between the two arms?
Yeah, the creation of the algorithm, you mean in this case. Because the exact study number is in the paper, so you can look at it. I'll get it wrong. But for the training set data, we actually use all of our data, and our data is an 80,000 person plan, right? Now, not all 80,000 people have CKD, but that's the whole point of the algorithm is we don't restrict it to the known CKD. That would defeat the purpose. So we use all of it as the training set of the data. And I would also note one thing, I should have mentioned this. We believe that many of our models exceed those trained on much larger training sets. And that's not because the law of large numbers doesn't work. Of course, more data is better. But we can go through many cycles and retraining because we're tuning it in production. So this was not the first model we built. Whereas something built in, say, I won't say academia, I'll say like Google Health, right? They only train one model because they have one huge data dump and then they make it. They don't get the benefit of feedback cycles. And so it's 80,000 person MA plan, but with many different training cycles on all sorts of behavior, physician behavior, all those kinds of things.
Okay, so this is interesting because, I'm sorry, what you're saying is that each time you have a model, you take it into the real world and you sort of test it and it comes.
That is correct. That is why I'm a computer scientist running a health insurance company, is literally the effect you just said. What he was saying was every single time we deploy a model, we test it and then we feed it back in. That's that feedback cycle that was in the middle of one of my slides. I cannot emphasize enough how much that is a benefit. Like if you're like, wow, 80,000 lives seems low, it's not tiny, but it's small, right? Overall, Google has like hundreds of millions of rows of data. I think that is the effect you're seeing of being able to iterate.
Please.
We don't want some populations ending up with this early monitoring, knowing what conditions they have, and some not, and a lot later and having to spend a lot more money on these procedures, a lot worse outcomes.
Yes. You want to repeat the question?
Yes. So how do we? I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but you can change. Like, how do we make sure that it's something that can be covered by insurance and we deployed in an insurance covered environment, but also how do we realistically make sure that we aren't introducing some biases or making sure the selection bias in who we deploy it to, or making some assumptions up front about who we should deploy it to? Is that kind of like the question? You can tune that if you want a little bit.
Yeah, that, but also like it's not an extremely expensive intervention that is not covered by insurance.
Oh, it's extreme intervention that's not covered by insurance. Okay. I see. So this is okay. Let me rephrase it. It's something that's covered. If it's how do you make it as available as possible to have as big an impact as possible? Because if it's really expensive and not covered by insurance, then there's like only certain people can afford it, for example. Okay. So there's a couple of different things. Number one, and this is a hopefully helpful, unhelpful answer to your question. the pricing of our interventions is borderline arbitrary in the United States. It's not actually based upon any kind of bill of materials. It's not really based upon it. It's actually based upon a profit. And I'm not a pure nonprofit person. I run a for-profit company. But number one, we can do just generalized price controls, because the most important thing is if something is really, really expensive and it's priced to be really, really expensive, then definitionally only so many people are going to get access to it, because we know that there's a finite amount of capital in the United States. We can't just give everybody everything. It just doesn't work that way. So costs have to come down. And so that's, like I said, it's not that's a whole question in and of itself on how to lower costs. But my short answer is, let's assume, for example, it's not an exorbitantly priced product. Like we have therapeutics that are $1 million over like 5 years. It's too expensive. Like there's only I actually cannot solve your problem at that level of price of therapeutic. Is that the first part of the question? The second part of the question, okay, Andrew, then how come when they're priced that highly? I think the answer is that our life sciences methodologies are built to generate these sort of like, it's like a hit-based business, basically, is how it goes there. What we need to do is unhit it, basically, where it becomes cheaper to develop the therapeutic. We saw a slide yesterday where it just takes longer and longer and longer, and the bars are higher and higher to actually get it out to market. What I would argue is if we are able to use AI to lower the cost of development, the cost of drugs, the cost of therapeutics in general will come down, which will then make them more available to a broader set of people as well. The last part of your question I would also say is that there's something called prior authorization. Many of you have heard about it. It's probably in the news. Well, it is in the news. You probably have heard about it. Prior authorization is almost always a reaction to having high-priced therapeutics as well. So what happens is, now that there's high-priced therapeutics, an insurance company has to put in these friction barriers so that everyone is not getting the high-priced therapeutic, which would be unaffordable and drive premiums up. And then what happens is, once you have prior authorization, everything slows down, including low-priced therapeutics. And now nobody's getting a good experience, and it's sort of broken everything. So to me, the short answer is we've got to bring that cost at the highest end drugs.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. There was one slide over there where your point about trying to develop diagnoses that we can go cohort back and cohort back and cohort
Yes.
back is really important when we're thinking about developing endpoints for
Yes.
trying to figure out what we're looking for and what our markers are. Is there any ones that you would want people to be more likely to include in their study? Pathophysiology and then targeting endpoints, or sorry, acute events like betting falls, things like prevention of how you go to the next level of care. Is there any way that you want to make sure people understand which ones are your priorities?
Yes. Thank you for the, like, it sounds like it resonated about having the cohort that can go one back and one back and one back and one back. And then I agree with you. That means like, how do you have chaining endpoints effectively to make that effective? And then what kind of endpoints I think you're asking would I would like to see go out there? Many different ones, and nothing's being taken off the table here. But the most useful endpoints for us to target are ones which are intuitive to a clinician, where it's almost an if this then that in their minds, right? The further away it goes from that, it's still useful, don't get me wrong, but it's harder because we still want to have a clinician go through everything in order to process an insight. So let me give you an example of that. Generally, if you have a PCP, very few PCPs are going to look at a A1C of a diabetic that's out of control and just say like, I'm just gonna ignore that. I'll just go do something else. They're not gonna do that. They're just going to look at it and say, okay. And if you're like, hey, I got ideas on what you want to do, they're like, no, I know what to do. I just got to talk to them and et cetera, et cetera. That's a pretty good one because now the human has taken off some of the work of the model. The more things where we have to like get involved, the more steps that are built into there, the less we're able to drive immediate impact in a real world environment, right? For the effect that we just did right there's a ton of data processing and ML models and all those kinds of things, but we try to digest something into something as simple as, for a clinician, have you noticed EGFR is declining? And they're like, I didn't notice that. Do you have a lab? Yes, we do. Here's the labs. Oh, okay. I know what to do. Off I go. Does that make sense? And so like look for endpoints that would be intuitive to a clinician and let them use their training and expertise to take it from there.
Yes, please.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So it sounds like your place of intervention is through the clinician.
Yes.
Right? That's really interesting. But you also mentioned like dementia's harder. We don't have a pill, but we have a lot of pills for dementia. If we use the term pill loosely, right? Like education at a certain age, like not smoking at this age, right? We have.
Yes.
So is there anything to do with that?
So we have interventions for dementia, was the question. And so what's the thought about the fact that when I said like it's a little bit different than the other ones? Great point. I think that's all true. I think I would join it with the previous question here, which is right now, not forever, right now what we're seeing as the real place to create the most actionability and impact right away is something where a PCP can be like, I got it. I know what to do, and almost intuitively know what to do when armed with the insight. And in this example, dementia, and I'm not an expert in dementia. We have one of these. I'm all for it. But I have not yet been shown one of these where it's easy for the PCP to say, I know what to do now, and go around there. If there is one, don't get me wrong, like I said, we should look at it. Does that make sense? Please.
So you mentioned you're a for-profit company.
We are.
So as you're developing these tools, have you developed sort of an ROI criteria that if you do these early identifications, you're going to improve the medical loss ratio, reduce hospitalizations, reduce visits to the ER?
Yes, medical loss ratio. Yes, we are a for-profit company. We don't do it on an ROI basis, however, because what I find is ROI is very, very loose. The concept is good, but the ability to calculate it is very, very loose in healthcare, right? And so I always take ROI calculations with a grain of salt. What we actually just try to say is, do we believe in the management methodology. Remember, we don't develop new management techniques. We rely on the existing literature and the papers to do management. We're not coming up with new stuff. We're almost pairing insights with the management methodology. If we don't think we have a good management methodology, we put it on aside for a second. If we do, then we basically use the calculations in the paper to back into an impact and say, is this going to be helpful to people? And if it is, then we generally proceed. So it's a form of ROI, but it's not a precise one because we just cannot be precise. It's impossible to do that. And one quick note, we don't do it on the basis of emergency room visits. In the older population, that is very important, but tends to be completely, somewhat orthogonal to, it tends to be related to like med-adherence, for example, related to are you taking your meds, behavioral health, socioeconomic status, those kinds of things.
Go ahead.
As a former CEO of the National Council on Aging, I've done a lot of work in Medicare Advantage. I think it's great that you're focusing on this, but 85% of chronic conditions are affected by behavior change, not by medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you factoring, or are you, we can help maybe, but that seems to be the missing piece of your equation. A doctor can say you should exercise, you should lose weight, blah, 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 but that very rarely produces the result.
Yes. So the question is that like their behavior change is critical for chronic condition management. I obviously completely agree. Not just therapeutics. A, of course, would love help with that. That's a great research area. B, I do think this is a really interesting place for AI and LLMs, where we were having a conversation at dinner last night, where I don't want the efficacy of the intervention to be proportionate to the persuasiveness of the doctor. I'm not sure that's necessarily the skill for which we select doctors. So we need another mechanism, and maybe AI-generated prompts are actually more persuasive, letting the doctor focus more on clinical judgment and things like that. That's putting aside family doctor trust and all those things. I think that goes under persuasiveness as well. And the last point I would put here as well is that we're just scratching the surface here. Excellent point. Where I would point to is no matter what, even if we are suggesting behavior change, the earlier we can do that is almost a universal good. You know what I mean? And that's why I feel so comfortable in where we're focused right now is no matter what it is, even if they don't end up doing it, well, that gives us 3 opportunities to suggest they stop smoking versus 1 opportunity to suggest they stop smoking. And maybe none of those will take, but at least we had 3 at-bats in that point. Thank you.
Yeah, so
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was fascinating, as was our previous conversations. I really look forward, and I hope that the pilots take advantage of your generous office.
Awesome.
I do think it's worth talking about that dichotomy, right? So we started today with Ruben and I talking about how aging is not a disease, and we need to get away from the medicalization of aging, right?
Yes.
And now we talk about aging as a chronic condition. So let's talk about that dichotomy.
Yeah.
We know that one's perception of aging affects the health outcomes. So we need to be careful about that framework.
I completely. So the dichotomy between this morning we were saying it's not a disease. We just said that it is a disease. I actually think we're solving ultimately the same problem for 2 different ways. If everyone has the disease, it's in a way not a stigmatized disease. Not in a pragmatic perspective, because obviously human beings don't think that way. But as a computer scientist who has a brain built of silicon, I'm like, these are identical, right? I agree that. Yeah. Like my wife was like, stop putting the words meat brain in your presentation. People are not going to like that. And I'm like, but that's what we talk about all the time. Like, don't say that. But I will say silicon brain for me says, I think we're solving the same problem. I do think we have to discuss the audience. So for framing to the general population, I probably would not say aging is a disease. It comes with so many connotations that I do not intend to pull into that. I'm actually very much with you from that perspective. From a perspective of computer science, I actually think we should think of it as a disease because then you cluster it with the right problem-solving techniques. Does that kind of make sense? And yeah. So I think 2 different problems we're actually solving with this framing.
We still have time for questions, please, in the back.
So first off, thank you very much.
Of course.
Agree with some of the things that we're talking about.
Just some, that's okay.
Get your take on is in our mind there is a lifetime healthcare cost associated with a human being.
Yeah,
if
sure.
we use AI and treat aging as a chronic disease, we're going to shift the cost spectrum associated with that patient or that human to be more equally distributed throughout their
fair.
entire healthcare lifecycle.
Fair conclusion.
I think that is a great thing. Has anybody looked at, discussed, or thought of how that shift impacts us economically?
So the question was, if we are able to left shift a lot of the care, we make it less intense at the right, maybe we keep the same area of the curve, hopefully a much lower area of the curve, but no matter what, it's shifted left, and so there's more at the earlier stages. I think that's basically what you're saying. So I think it's a couple different things. Has anyone looked at the implications? I think we're just starting to see these connections coming through because as per this whole symposium, people still divided into old age and younger. I also think this is more of a thought because I think it's an insightful point. The US is one of the only places in the world which segments its older population in terms of how it delivers healthcare. Right? Only we have, because we don't have generalized socialized care. Most places either have socialized care smoothed over the entire period. We only have it when you go into Medicare, even though it's not for everyone, but it's for most people. And so I think from that perspective, our data sets don't necessarily flow between those as easily. So the answer to that, if you were saying who would have looked at that, I would point to countries, the NHS probably will have more data on that. I don't have that right now. I think Israel would have data on that. I think Hong Kong would have data on that. Places with like almost very, very deep universal coverage throughout the entire life. Yeah, so excellent point. I don't actually have an answer, but I do agree with your conclusion. Sure.
Were you saying that when we think about using AI in dementia, are you thinking that we don't yet have the right data insights or we don't have the right therapeutics yet?
It's the next step. For dementia, is it that we don't have the data insights, we don't have the therapeutics yet? I intended to say we don't have we need both. and we're developing the former at a faster rate than the latter is what I would say. And even when we have the latter, it tends not to be something which is easily delivered within the concept of the existing healthcare system. So I'm not saying that will stay forever. I think we should do research on it. I'm just saying that's how it's perceived right now, certainly by my company.
John, and then the gentleman in the back.
So thank you very much for a great talk. A couple of thoughts here. Well, I agree early identification is really important. And really it tends to, when you think about screening for given types of chronic conditions where there's a whole slew of criteria of biomarkers and screening that you need to check boxes off to make sure they're appropriate.
Yes.
That said, there are certain chronic diseases where there's such heterogeneity. And I think that's one thing that we really want to think about when we think about aging individuals, is the heterogeneity that's observed in aging. One older adult is one older adult is one older adult. So early identification, let's use the example of chronic kidney disease, that person may not develop end-stage renal disease. And that, playing devil's advocate, would have cost implications to the system. So I think
agree with that.
So my question here is, how do you make that a more cost-effective, using AI to make a more cost-effective kind of model where the treatment may not be ideal for every individual?
Yes. So the question is that like if we are able to left shift, but not everyone has equal outcomes at the end, even if they look similar at a given period. So the first point I would put is agree with the problem. We should just get better and better and better. Meaning, to your point, once we know what people actually look like and we can basically make the cohort smaller, basically, right? Like it's hard to get to the individual right now, but you can make it bigger than just overall. You have this, therefore that, right? And how it goes. Next is, I will always come back to this. Knowing it earlier is always better, is what I would say. The decision we make at that point is then more informed. It's better than just being not necessarily uninformed, but just not doing anything at all. So that's why I'm so focused on bringing it to the attention of a clinician at an earlier stage. And I think that's critically important. And the last point I would say is not everyone's outcomes are necessarily the same. And I completely agree with this. This is something that I was going to bring up earlier. So for me, for example, let's use the Marfan example. I was like, I actually, just for clarity for everyone, I don't have Marfan. I actually don't have Marfan. I have something called Lloyd-Dietz syndrome, and it is a different genetic mutation than Marfan. I just have 2 Marfanoid mutations, and almost everyone has one. So what happened was we looked for the mutation, we found the first one, you're in the Marfan category, right? And then years later, like decades later, did another test and found the second mutation, and I'm in the other, and I'm in the other category. So I think that what that has sort of burned into my brain with your example here is that what we need to do is just arm people with the best information they can at any given time and not aim for the perfection, because no matter what, it would be the same therapeutic for me in both cases, right? You could argue, but your chance of XYZ is different between the two. Same pill, actually, between the two. So even though we made a different conclusion, better to know earlier and do something than to maybe wait and lose the opportunity. So not a perfect answer, but we're not there yet.
Last question, briefly.
Thank you for your awesome presentation. So I have a question regarding, coverage of dementia and Alzheimer's as it relates to insurance.
Insurance coverage for Alzheimer's and dementia. Sure.
At least from what I know, what I've researched is that it's very difficult to cover anything just because it's not categorized as a problem to solve, right?
Yes.
So I'm not aware of the whether these drugs are being covered or not, so that I'd like to have a clarification on that. But as it relates to the cohort companies, what kind of avenues do you think will open up in the future as the partnership between CMS and evolves to kind of start covering some of these things that you mentioned?
Got it. How do we think about coverage of Alzheimer's? How do we think about how CMS thinks about these kinds of things? I'm not from CMS, but I'm happy to represent a little bit about how they think about it. And then one quick one out of the way. If CMS makes something called a national coverage determination, if they say it's covered, everyone has to fall in line, whether we agree with it or not. Let me just answer that part first. It's easier. So if CMS says it's covered, all MA plans must cover it. If CMS doesn't cover it, we as private plans are allowed to cover it. We are just not. It's not mandatory. Does that make sense as a first part? So let's just get that out of the way. Next, how do we think about the coverage? So let me just set people's intuition here. Why do we even call it insurance? And it actually no longer makes sense to call it insurance. But if you want a quick thing, I have a whole talk on this, but maybe the quick thing. What was insurance? Insurance is a way of spreading the cost of very acute localized events over an entire population to make that acute event economically survivable if it happens to you, right? Like 5% of ships will sink at sea. If it happens to be, if your ship doesn't sink, you're all good. If your ship sinks, you're out of business as a merchant. You buy insurance, right? That's how we used to cover it. And I think the reason why we still use it for insurance was 100 years ago, healthcare looked like that. We had so few therapeutics that really it was like the equivalent of something happening to you. It was the equivalent of the ship sinking at sea. Like even cancer, we didn't understand enough. You're just like, oh, you have cancer. Okay, well that's bad. It's like a reactive event. It's almost like trauma, right? Where you're like, the tree fell on you, you got cancer. Very equivalent. So that's why we use insurance as the model to cover all these things. As we move to more chronic conditions, as we move to things like this, it starts to become a little bit more unusual because insurance is very good. That says you got in a car accident. I validate you had a car accident. I validate you were not at fault, and then I will pay as the insurer for your car to be fixed. Does that make sense? Insurance is very good at that kind of thing. Now, imagine you crashed your car, an extreme example. Imagine you crashed your car and you said, you know what? I don't want you to fix the car. Sorry. Imagine you went there and you got into a fender bender and I'm like, I'll repair your bumper. And you said, I don't want the bumper repaired. I want you to buy me a whole new car. Well, almost all of us would say that's not reasonable. The insurance company probably just covers repairing your bumper. You don't ask for a whole new car. let's take an even more extreme example. Let's say you get in a car accident, you get into a fender bender, and you say, I want you to fix my car, and the way I want you to fix my car is I want you to pay for Taylor Swift to come and fix my car, right? And I'd be like, it's not just the cost of Taylor Swift. I'm not even sure that Taylor Swift knows how to fix your car, right? Like, it's not even just the cost. Why is this what you think will fix your car? That's a very extreme example. And I think, and even I'm being a little facetious, I am not joking when I say that that is the state that the Alzheimer's drugs are perceived with right now. You're saying, I'm sorry, well, actually, let's just go to the drugs. People are saying, but maybe it'll fix the car. In the same way, maybe Taylor Swift will fix my car, right? Well, we can't afford to fund that on maybes. So it gets stuck in this, well, is it going to work? Is it not going to work? And we end up in this massive debate about those areas. If we knew it would work, but it's very expensive, which was the question from on this side of the room, that's a very different determination. We do know how to make those particular decisions. The ambiguity with the Alzheimer's drugs is in whether they are efficacious and they're extraordinarily expensive. When you're both, then it's very hard to end up with a coverage determination.
Please join me in thanking Andrew for a wonderful talk. And thank you for all the thoughtful questions. I turn it to Professor Damiris to end the symposium for us. And thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for attending the symposium. I think it's been a really productive, insightful 2 days. And so all of you will receive tomorrow a survey. I do hope you get a chance to fill it out and give us feedback so that we can take that into consideration for next year's symposium,